Hello and welcome to today's Hare's Corner Pond Talk. We're going to be looking at the do's and don'ts of pond construction. Okay, so the first thing to consider is your pond location. Ideally, your pond location would be at a low saucer area within the landscape that holds water that runs off from the land around it. Here we've got a field drain leading down into a shallow saucer of ground that was naturally flooding anyway, and we've just removed some of the soil in order to create our pond. So it's a fairly straightforward construction. So ideally, I suppose what you'd do is you'd ask the question, what's the minimum amount of work that I can put in here for the maximum amount of water that I'm holding? That's one essential way to look at a wildlife pond in terms of selecting a location for it. The next thing is to check your soil type and your likely water inputs, and that will tell you whether you're likely to need a plastic liner or whether you can use the existing subsoil for lining your pond. So if you've got very heavy clay soil that drains really poorly, then you probably won't need a plastic liner at all. Similarly with peaty soil, if you're on boggy ground, you might have the potential for re-wetting every bit as much as making a pond. But if you've got free-draining, loamy soil, particularly in the burren overlying limestone, then a liner will be needed. And the flip side of that is assessing the water input. So here we've got a farm drain, so it's quite straightforward. That's water coming through already. It needs to be filtered a little bit in a couple of silt traps, but it's basically a steady supply of water for most of the year. You may have a farmyard roof, a barn roof, or the roof of your house, or just fields that are leading directly into your pond. Now, the more water input that you have, the less robust your liner needs to be. That's the main correlation there between those two. So once you've got a design in your mind, the next thing is to put it down on paper. So sketch it out. And sketching it out is important for two reasons. It clarifies the design in your own mind, three reasons. Clarifies the design. It also helps you to communicate with your digger driver so that you can give the digger driver an impression of the final finish that you want. And there's a third very important reason for sketching it, and that is to communicate adequately with your spouse about what your plans are before you get the digger on site. That's always really, really useful. The next thing is to dig your pond larger than the final water surface area. Here there was a large area of excavation and a large area of spoil where the excavated soil was removed to. So it looks like a very, very big area during the construction phase. And then as the plants begin to encroach and fill in, and as the edges thicken up with grasses and terrestrial plants again, suddenly your pond area shrinks down and down and down. So for the Hare's Corner, the recommended minimum size is 5 metres by 5 metres, or 25 square metres. I'm not proposing a rectangle. Or even a circle. So with that in mind, you need to make sure that your initial excavated area is bigger than that. Now, if you're using a plastic liner, you're going to need to bring back in subsoil in on top of your liner, and that'll make your pond smaller again. So make sure at the outset you dig it large enough. So the next thing is to make the edges very, very gently sloping. The most interest for wildlife is in the top few centimetres of water. So here you can see very shallow sloping edges making their way down into the water. So there's a good big broad pond edge around the pond area, around the open surface water. And in that way you maximise the interest for plants and you maximise the interest for wildlife, for insects, and therefore for the birds that come in and feed on them, and for mammals to come and drink, and for amphibians to climb in and out easily. So there's lots of reasons to have a very, very gently sloping edge. Ideally shallower than 1 in 5 if you can. Now, the shallower it is, the more area you need to get your depth, but at the same time, if you can have it, as much of the pond edge shallow as possible, then go for that. You can see that in the middle here where the island is, we just cut a clean slope away and pulled the material back. And that was in order to maximise the surface pond area. So ideally we should have gone a little bit more shallower there, but there are areas where it can be steep as long as you've got plenty very, very shallow slope around the pond edge as well. And the next thing is to allow for seasonal variation in depth. Seasonal variation is really good because it encourages lots of different types of plants to grow, and then the different insects that come in to feed on those plants. So here we've got water flowing in from a farm drain, and then at the outlet point what we've got is a riser pipe. It's a 6-inch pipe that's rising up into the pond. So when the water reaches a certain level, the pond water flows out into that 6-inch pipe and away off into the old land drains that it used to feed into anyway. What I've done here is I've simply placed a Liscannor flagstone in on top of the riser pipe. And so what happens is, as the water is rising up and going through the gap between the Liscannor flagstone and the pipe, it soaks down slowly through that gap between the stone and the plastic. And plastic and debris will catch on that and slow the water down even further. So in times of particularly heavy rainfall, what happens is the debris catches, slows the flow even further, and we get the pond flooding. And that's quite a constructive thing in this context. It does two things. It provides that ecological variation in water depth, and what it also does is it provides storage of water within the landscape, slowing down that rush of water into the river and into the streams downstream. And that can be really beneficial from a hydrological point of view, to prevent flooding and to prevent droughts then in drier weather, and it also helps to filter the water. So the next thing to bear in mind is that if you're using a plastic liner, make sure that the bed of the pond is lined very, very carefully. Not so much lined very carefully, is prepared very carefully with just get a rake in, remove any sharp stones, remove any sticks or twigs, and just take those out before you put in your plastic liner, because otherwise the pressure of the soil and the water on top of that will press that liner down and run the risk of puncturing your liner. Now, in tandem with that, what you do is you'd also make sure that your liner is not stretched taut and that there aren't hollows where the liner is stretched over a hollow within the pond area. If you do that, you run the risk that when you put back in your subsoil and your water on top of that, the water weight will press down and stretch your liner against stones or sharps that might be there, or even just put too much pressure on the liner itself and the liner might rip. So when the liner is in place on the bed of your system, make sure it's resting comfortably and nice and loose on the soil beneath it. And then finally, hide your liner. So if you're using a liner, then bring back in subsoil on top of the liner to a depth of maybe 8 inches, sometimes up to a foot, and cover over your liner fully with that in order to protect the liner from ultraviolet rays from the sun, which would decay it, to protect it from potential livestock getting into the area. The pond should be fenced, but just in case. And in order to protect it aesthetically as well, just visually, just that that you don't have a plastic liner there. And it also provides better habitat for wildlife if you've got a soil cover over your plastic liner, because wildlife can't do much with the plastic. So if you can see plastic, it means that's valuable habitat area that's not possible really to utilise by the insects and by amphibians and by other aquatic life within the water. So afterwards, when your pond has been built and you've got your soil in and you've topped it up with water from the rain, or from if you've got roof water coming in from a gutter or a farm drain, once it's topped up, let me see, I'm trying to get my train of thought. I've got my notes here in front of me. So when the pond is in place, don't be overly keen to plant it. Let the plants establish naturally, but one thing to do is to keep an eye out, and if you've got particularly vigorous plants like bulrush or common reed, which I have bulrush here and common reed further up the catchment, if you've got vigorous plants, then you might want to take those out if it's a smallish pond. Common reed and bulrush will grow in areas that are almost up to 1 metre deep, sometimes a little bit more than that. And so what happens is that they can encroach quite a lot and move into the area. Here, it's fine. I sell plants for constructed wetlands and reed beds anyway. So it's an area that I've been using for harvesting plants for a long time. But if you've got a pond for wildlife or a pond for aesthetics within your farm, then bulrush encroachment may not be something you want. And the easiest time to keep it in check is at the outset, when it's becoming established for the first time. And then enjoy, sit back, watch the plants emerge, see what develops, keep an eye out for birds and for wildlife, and make mental notes of what's going on within your hare's corner. So those are the do's, those are the things that we can do to create our pond. I'm going to look very briefly at some don'ts, just to see what things to avoid, simple mistakes that can happen along the way. The first one is, don't flood your neighbours. If you're building a dam within a farm drain, then you need to make sure that any water that's held by that dam is held on your own land, on your own farm, and doesn't push back up along into neighbouring land and flood neighbouring cropland. So that's one that's really important to keep in mind. The other thing is, don't create a safety hazard. If you do have steep edges somewhere, then make sure that they're relatively regular so that it's possible to see the open water, and keep that area free of pond plants potentially, because otherwise you create a safety hazard where you've got deep water covered by plants quite close to the edge. The easiest way to keep it safe is to make sure that your edge slope is very, very gentle. So people just end up sloshing around in their ankles rather than plunging suddenly headlong into deeper water. Don't remove existing valuable habitat. That's a really important one if you're putting in a new pond on a farm. So if you've got old grassland, if you've got species-rich grasslands, or if you've got native woodland, be careful to avoid those areas. Or if you've got existing wetland habitats in the area, if you've got a flush or a spring with really interesting plants growing within that area. So when I say really interesting, if you're not an ecologist, how do you know? If the species in a damp area of the farm look different from the species that are growing in the rest of the field, then assume that there's going to be interesting wetland species. And rather than building right within that channel where those species are, if you can build just beside that, it means that you're broadening out the potential habitat that's available, rather than restricting it, taking out a species-rich area and putting in a pond, which will also be species-rich, but it won't necessarily have the same mix of species that were there before. Now, don't be too neat on the edge detail. I know I've spoken about this in safety, that you need to have a regular enough surface, but if your edge detail can undulate and move around like a slightly scalloped edge around your pond, you maximize the edge length. And edges are where all the interesting stuff happens. So if you can maximize the edge length, so much the better. So a pond that's shaped like a starfish will have a greater pond edge length than a pond that's shaped like a circle. So if you can manage to do that, have those undulations, just here behind me, you can see where the pond juts out, goes back in, moves around. There's regular sections as well, but there are those undulations around the place, and that maximizes the edge length. And certainly the depth variation will exist as well within that, which all maximizes the interest for wildlife. A flip side of that is don't dig too deep. You know, if you dig your pond 2 meters deep, then you might be able to swim in it. That might be fine. It might hold an awful lot of water if you want it for irrigation higher up in the land. But if you're looking for a wildlife pond, which the Hare's Corner is by definition, then having a gentle slope down into a pond. Here we've got about 2 foot depth and 3 foot depth in places, and that kind of depth is ideal. So you've got a lot of edge, and then it's moving gradually down into the middle, partly to hold water in the summer as much as anything else, so that it doesn't dry out completely. Next, just consider don't place your soil up gradient. If you're relying on runoff from the fields above you, don't dig out your pond and dump the soil up, blocking the area where the water runoff is coming from, because it'll limit the amount that your pond can be replenished. And something else that it will do is it might create damp areas upstream of your pond. And ideally, I suppose, you'd build your pond in a relatively damp part of the field that's not easy to farm. And so by removing soil from that area and moving it somewhere else, if you can spread it out carefully close to that area, you improve the ground and dry it out elsewhere, and then you make your pond even wetter. And those two contrasting things can give you a nice wildlife habitat pond and improve the quality of the land around you. So don't place your spoil uphill. Or here, one of the things that we've done is we've created a channel through an upstream drain, a separate drain off to the side, and we've moved the spoil left and right, leaving that main channel open so any water running off can flow into that channel and then into the pond. Now, bear in mind that if you've got a plastic liner, don't damage your plastic. So sharps, stones, sticks, not stretching it too much, those are all things to avoid. Once your soil goes back on, be really careful not to drive on that liner again. So don't bring a machine back in onto the liner edge. So fill from the edge and move back, rolling out the liner as you go, or potentially even limit the amount of soil that you put on into the middle, possibly even with wheelbarrows. And you can make it thinner in the middle because you won't get livestock or crowbars going through the liner in the very centre. Make sure there's enough soil around the outer edge, but be sure not to bring a machine back in on top of that soil after the liner has gone in. The other thing to consider is don't rush to plant. There's ponds all around the country that have lots of plants around them, and they look lovely and they're great, But a habitat that's not particularly well represented is just bare earth. So once you've dug out your pond, if you've got clean water and bare soil, that will provide all sorts of interest for a particular type of ecological niche that doesn't really get a look in a lot of places. So here, this soil was all bare initially, and it's after encroaching quite quickly with willows, with grasses, with bulrush, with lower plants. Algae is coming in to mop up nitrogen and phosphorus, and there's duckweed around in places. So those have all come in since it was exposed. And so just don't be in too much of a rush to plant your pond. And I'm saying that as somebody who sells plants. You don't need to ring me, you don't need plants. Just to keep that in mind. If you want plants, yellow flag iris form quite an attractive architectural feature, if you like, a structural feature, and they look beautiful and they spread relatively modestly. And water mint is a lovely one, another lovely pond plant. So there are plants that you can put in if you want to get something initially, and you may well find plants in your local drain or local ditch. Be aware that in East Clare in particular, there's quite a lot of invasive species in the river systems around East Clare and in the lakes. So be very careful not to introduce invasive species into your pond. And the easiest way to avoid that is just to take your plants from somewhere very, very local. Okay, and now finally, this is possibly the most important one. Be aware not to overthink the process. Okay, don't overthink it. Don't fret about it. Do your design, get your digger in, dig your pond, let it fill with water quite naturally, let it colonise with plants. Don't overthink the process. If you find that you think, okay, I've done this, but I should have done that, should have done the other, then build a second pond and learn from your mistakes. Build a third, talk to a neighbour, see if you can tell your neighbour all the mistakes you made in order to move forward and have lots of different drafts of your pond. And so enjoy it, watch the wildlife develop and grow, and enjoy your Hare's Corner pond. So thank you very much for watching. And I understand that Karen will be answering any questions you have. I'm pre-recording this so that I can be present at Heritage Week while I'm on holidays. And good luck with your pond building. Thanks for watching.